Okay, so let's transport ourselves back in time for a second, back to London in the year 1381. Now, if you're picturing the bustling metropolis we know today, you got to hit rewind. Think a city still kind of reeling from the Black Death. Streets are crowded with merchants. The air is thick with the sounds of trade. And looming over it all is that imposing Tower of London. But here's where things get really interesting. Imagine tens of thousands of rebels right there at the city gates. They're demanding radical changes, changes that could rewrite the course of English history. And that right there is where our deep dive begins today, straight into the heart of the Peasants' Revolt.
It's amazing when you think about it. This event often gets overshadowed by other historical milestones, but it really captures the simmering tensions brewing in medieval England.
It absolutely does, and that's what we're going to do today. We're going to peel back the layers of this uprising. We're going to figure out what drove these people to such extremes and what it tells us about the power dynamics of that era. You know, one thing that always hits me about this period is just how precarious life was back then. The Black Death had just ravaged Europe a few decades earlier, wiping out huge swaths of the population.
Oh, absolutely. The impact of the Black Death on society and the economy was profound. Suddenly there was a labor shortage, and that empowered the peasantry. They could demand better wages. But on the flip side, you had landowners desperately clinging to the old feudal system. They were trying to maintain their control. So you had this clash, aspirations versus anxieties, playing out on a massive scale.
It's like watching the old order crumble under pressure. And then as if things weren't tense enough already, the government throws another log on the fire. This infamous new tax, the poll tax.
Right. Basically, it was a head tax, levied on every adult, regardless of income, regardless of social standing. And it was seen as incredibly unfair, especially by the peasantry, who were already struggling to make ends meet.
And it wasn't just the peasantry feeling the squeeze. We're talking craftsmen, shopkeepers, even some members of the clergy. They all saw this tax as a symbol of a system rigged against them.
Exactly. The poll tax became a focal point. For all these pent-up grievances, it went beyond just the money. It was about power. Who had the power to impose such burdens? And who was really benefiting from it?
So let's dive into these rebels themselves. Who were they? What were they fighting for?
So the term peasant, it can be a little misleading. Yes, agricultural laborers were a big part of the rebel force, but it was a much more diverse group than that. You had skilled artisans, urban workers, even some members of the lower nobility joining the ranks. And what united them? This deep sense of injustice, this feeling that the system was designed to keep them down.
So they were aiming for something much bigger than a tax cut.
Oh, absolutely. Their demands were far more radical. They called for the abolition of serfdom. Imagine that. Reshaping the entire social hierarchy of England. They wanted an end to all those tolls and trade restrictions, the ones hindering economic opportunity. And some even demanded reforms within the church itself. They were inspired by preachers like John Ball and John Wycliffe.
Hold on, let's talk about those radical preachers for a second. John Ball in particular, fascinating figure. He traveled around preaching this message of equality, that famous line, "When Adam delved and Eve span, who was then the gentleman."
Right. He was tapping into something powerful, a deep well of resentment toward the nobility and the church hierarchy. His message resonated with people who felt that the traditional social order was divinely ordained.
And then you have Wycliffe, with his calls for a simpler, less corrupt church, fueling the flames of discontent even further.
So you've got this potent mix brewing: economic hardship, social unrest, religious fervor. It's like all the ingredients for an explosion are in place. Exactly. And that explosion comes in June of 1381. Tens of thousands of rebels descend upon London. Picture this for a moment. These masses of people, armed with whatever they could find, pitchforks, axes, even crude swords, marching on the capital, their anger and determination palpable.
London must have been in a state of utter panic.
You can only imagine. The fear, the tension, gripping the city. London was this vibrant hub of commerce and power, and suddenly it's under siege.
So this wasn't just random violence. The rebels had specific targets in mind.
Oh, they were remarkably strategic. They focused their wrath on symbols of authority and oppression. Their first target, Savoy Palace, the lavish London residence of John of Gaunt.
And John of Gaunt was a pretty powerful figure.
Oh, absolutely. He was the Duke of Lancaster,
Yeah.
the wealthiest man in England, the king's uncle. He was everything the rebels hated: wealth, privilege, a system designed to benefit the elite.
So what happened when those rebels reached Savoy Palace?
They tore it down, literally razed it to the ground, burned everything they could find. It was a powerful statement about their anger, about their desire to dismantle the existing power structure.
And Savoy Palace wasn't the only target. They went after the Tower of London as well, that supposedly impenetrable fortress symbolizing royal authority.
The tower represented oppression, a prison, a treasury, the most visible symbol of the king's power. For the rebels to even dare attack it shows just how bold and determined they were.
So here you have it. Rebels surrounding London, chaos in the streets, and at the center of it all,
Yeah.
a 14-year-old king, Richard II. What's going through his mind as all this unfolds?
I mean, can you imagine a 14-year-old kid
Yeah.
essentially trapped in the tower, surrounded by advisors who are probably just as terrified as he is?
And he's 14 years old. Can you imagine being thrown into that situation? At that age, you're leading a kingdom, you're facing down a rebellion, and on top of all that, you're trying to figure out who to trust, what the right move is.
Right, and you have to remember the whole context of medieval kingship. The king was seen as God's chosen representative on earth, with a duty to protect his people. And maybe that's what influenced Richard. He decides to take a risk. He agrees to meet with the rebels.
Whoa, hold on. To meet with them face to face, that seems incredibly dangerous, especially for a young king with no real experience.
It was a bold move, shows a certain level of courage. His advisors must have been horrified, but for the rebels, this was a huge win. They saw the king as a potential ally, someone they could persuade to side with them against his own corrupt officials.
So where did this meeting actually take place?
At Mile End, this big open space just outside the city walls, thousands of rebels gathered there, waiting to hear what the king had to say.
Do you know anything about the atmosphere? What was it like?
Well, the chroniclers describe a mix of anticipation and anxiety. You have these rebels, armed, carrying banners, chanting slogans, but there's also a sense of hope. They really believed the king would listen, that he would grant their demands.
And did he? Did Richard agree to their demands?
To a surprising degree. It must have been a shock to his advisors and to the rebels themselves. Richard agrees to a series of concessions. He promises to abolish serfdom, to end most of the tolls and trade restrictions, and to address their concerns about corruption.
Wow. So he basically agreed to dismantle the whole feudal system. Was he really sympathetic to their cause? Or was this just a tactic, a way to buy himself some time?
That's the million-dollar question. Historians have been debating this for centuries. Some say Richard was genuinely moved by the plight of his people, that he saw an opportunity for a more just society. Others think he was just playing for time, making promises he never intended to keep, just to defuse the situation and regain control.
It's fascinating to consider those different perspectives. So what happens next? Richard makes these concessions. Do the rebels just pack up and go home?
Some did. They thought they'd achieved their goals, but many stayed in London. The situation was still very volatile. There were pockets of unrest. The tension in the city was thick.
So things were far from settled.
Oh, yeah. And this is where things take another turn. Emboldened by the king's apparent support, a group of rebels decides to march on the Tower of London.
The tower? But that's supposed to be the most secure fortress in the kingdom. How did they even get in?
Another mystery for the history books. Some theories suggest there might have been sympathizers inside. Maybe some guards fearing for their lives just opened the gates. Whatever the reason, the rebels breached the supposedly impenetrable tower.
And they captured the king?
Richard wasn't there at the time, but they did find some of his top advisors, the Archbishop of Canterbury, Simon Sudbury, and the treasurer, Robert Hales. Both men were deeply unpopular, symbols of the corruption and oppression that the rebels were fighting against.
What happened to them?
The rebels captured them and executed them. It was a brutal act. Highlights the volatile nature of the revolt. They weren't just seeking redress, they wanted revenge.
So let's recap. The rebels have secured major concessions from the king. They've breached the Tower of London and executed some of his most powerful advisors. It seems like they're on the verge of achieving their goals.
It does seem that way, doesn't it? But the story is not over yet. The events at the tower mark a turning point, a shift from negotiation to violence. And that shift will have huge consequences for both the rebels and the king.
Last we left off, the rebels had just stormed the Tower of London. They'd executed some of the king's advisors. Must felt like a huge victory for them at the time. But like you mentioned, the rebellion wasn't just contained to London. What was happening in the rest of England?
Well, news of what was happening in London spread like wildfire. Uprisings popped up all over southeastern England, in villages, in towns. It's crucial to remember that those grievances driving the revolt, they weren't unique to London. The poll tax, restrictions on labor, corruption in the courts. These issues hit a nerve with people all across the country.
So it's like a ripple effect. The events in London were just the catalyst for this massive wave of unrest.
Precisely. And it's out in those rural areas where you really see the true diversity of the rebel movement. Of course, you had the agricultural laborers, but also artisans, clergymen, even some minor landowners joined the cause. Their demands often reflected their own local concerns. But there was this overarching theme, this feeling that the social order was inherently unjust, and it needed a complete overhaul.
So how did the authorities respond to these uprisings?
With brute force. Figures like John of Gaunt, who had been away from London when the revolt first erupted, they came back with a vengeance. He led a campaign of repression, crushing rebellions in Essex, Kent, other areas. Hundreds, maybe even thousands of rebels were executed, often without any trial.
That's a stark contrast to the approach Richard took in London, that initial willingness to negotiate. What do you make of that shift?
Well, it's possible Richard, being so young and inexperienced, was overwhelmed by the sheer scale of the revolt. Maybe he bowed to pressure from his advisors and truly believed that restoring order meant showing force.
Or maybe he realized those concessions he made at Mile End, they were just too radical, that they were unraveling the fabric of English society.
That's certainly a possibility. And it's worth pointing out that even as Richard was quashing rebellions in the countryside, he was also taking back the promises he'd made in London. Those charters abolishing serfdom, revoked, the poll tax, eventually reinstated, the rebels' calls for reform, largely ignored.
So in the grand scheme of things,
Yeah.
was the Peasants' Revolt a failure?
If you're talking about their immediate goals, then yes, they didn't achieve their most radical aims, and many paid a terrible price for their defiance. But the impact of the revolt runs much deeper than simple victory or defeat.
What do you mean? What was the lasting legacy of this uprising?
The Peasants' Revolt forced those in power to finally acknowledge those deep-seated grievances of the common people. It exposed the cracks in that old feudal system. With its rigid hierarchy and inequality, it showed that it was no longer unchallengeable.
So you're saying it was a catalyst for change, even if those changes took time to materialize.
Exactly. For example, the poll tax. It was never levied in the same way again. The revolt also played a role in the decline of serfdom, which gradually faded away in the centuries that followed.
It's incredible to think this uprising that was so brutally suppressed could have such a lasting impact on England.
It is. It reminds us that history is full of these seemingly small moments that can trigger profound and enduring change.
And that's the beauty of really diving deep into these events. We can see beyond the simple narrative of winners and losers. We can grasp the complex forces that shape our world.
Precisely. The Peasants' Revolt may not have achieved immediate victory, but it planted seeds for future change, inspiring generations to challenge injustice, to fight for a fairer society.
Well, that brings us to the end of our deep dive into the Peasants' Revolt, a story of courage, desperation, and the timeless human desire for freedom and justice. We hope you found it insightful, and if you're hungry for more fascinating historical journeys, be sure to subscribe to The Deep Dive wherever you get your podcasts.